link in here for the purposes of the two cardinal sins, the cardinal sin of asymptomatic virus and then transmission without that symptom as well, and the inability to make an immune response. I mean, that's the cardinal sins of gain-of-function research. What purpose would there be if you're wanting to develop vaccines? Is there any civilian purpose, or is this, in fact, a bioweapon?
I can't say it's a bioweapon because that's in the mind of the person that made it, but it is highly unusual, highly synthetic. They were doing synthetic biology around it, and its two functions are quite remarkable with respect to what kind of research you would do in the civilian world.
Dr. Ebert, is there a possibility that it could have been a dual purpose, that they could have been used as a bioweapon?
So the original SARS virus, SARS-CoV-1, is a Tier 1 select agent in the United States. So it is in the group of pathogens and biological toxins that our federal government has identified as having high potential for use as a bioweapon in biowarfare, bioterrorism, or biocrime. It, by definition, therefore, according to our federal government, is a bioweapon agent. It is not a bioweapon, but it is an agent that potentially could be used.
Is there any good reason to put this in the virus if you're developing a vaccine?
I would return to my general comment on gain-of-function research on potential pandemic pathogens. That research has no civilian practical application. Researchers undertake it because it is fast, it is easy, it requires no specialized equipment or skills, and it was prioritized for funding and has been prioritized for publication by scientific journals. These are major incentives to researchers worldwide, in China and in the US. The researchers undertake this research because it's easy, they get the money, and they can get the papers.
Here's Senator Marshall. Senator Scott, you're recognized for your questions.
First, I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for hosting this hearing. We should did this a lot. I think there's a lot that we still need to learn. The COVID pandemic was devastating for our country, as we all know. The response by the Biden administration and the media has done nothing but amplify the consequences of this crisis and erode trust in our federal government. Not long ago, anyone asking questions about the origins of COVID and the possibility of this virus resulting from a lab leak were branded as conspiracy theorists. Just like the Hunter Biden laptop story, the experts said this was disinformation and waged a campaign against members of Congress, medical professionals, and everyone else asking questions to discredit them as liar and extremist. Anthony Fauci led the charge in this public smear campaign, and I think it's great that he's not there anymore. We know that this is not only a credible theory, but the most likely cause of the pandemic. Communist China can't be trusted, and because the Biden administration has chosen weak appeasement of the CCP, we still haven't forced accountability or got the answers the American public deserve. HHS Office of the Inspector General did a review of the EcoHealth Alliance and its management of the grant contract. EcoHealth received funds and had the Wuhan Institute as a subcontractor. It's my understanding that NIH requires annual data reporting for what we spend money on and the research data. The Wuhan Institute never provided or only provided partial data. EcoHealth either failed to submit or submitted incomplete data. NIH failed to police their own grant program and allowed this to slide for years. About 85% of EcoHealth's budget comes from federal research grants. I have no idea why NIH would think it's a good idea to give U.S. tax dollars to Communist China. It seems like a pretty poor idea to me. Dr. Ebright, would it make sense to hold grant recipients accountable for the failure to comply with the terms of their grants? Why not require the prime grantee to fully reimburse the government if they or one of their subcontractees fail to fully comply with the terms of the grant? Seems like we do that with our personal life. If somebody does the wrong thing, they owe us the money back. So what do you think?
We do currently hold the grantee responsible, not only for the primary award, but for subawards, for subcontracts. When a researcher submits a grant proposal to NIH, when a researcher submits each annual grant progress report to NIH, the researcher signs a certification box. And that certification box says that the researcher will comply with the terms and condition of the grant and will provide full and factual information upon request, subject to administrative, civil, and criminal penalties. So the basis for accountability exists.
Has EcoHealth been held accountable? Have they given us any money back?
To my knowledge, there has been no clawback of funding from EcoHealth. There has, however, been an immediate suspension that went into effect a month ago, both of EcoHealth Alliance and then this month of its president, a suspension of eligibility for federal funding of all forms, and a referral for debarment from eligibility for federal funding from all sources.
Do you know any instances where NIH has ever held anybody accountable and gotten the money back?
Yes, so this has happened in a number of cases. Examples include data fraud. Other examples include sexual harassment or other forms of abuse that are outside the terms and conditions of the grant.
So why do you think they haven't gotten the money back from EcoHealth? Why haven't they been held accountable?
I would place that burden on Congress and on the White House, in that the NIH is unlikely to move toward clawback without motivation from either Congress or the White House.
But it's their job.
It is their job, but it is also the job of our legislative branch through its oversight responsibility and our executive branch through its primary responsibility to ensure that jobs are carried out.
Do you know anybody at NIH that's ever been fired for failure to do their job?
You mean an NIH staffer?
Oh, yeah.
As part of the administrative staff at NIH?
Have you heard of anybody?
I do not.
Has anybody you know of ever been fired from NIH over what they did by not enforcing the EcoHealth grant program?
Not to my knowledge.
Yep. So as you said, EcoHealth has been suspended by further funding with possible disbarment, but they're currently appealing it. Do you think it's right to debar them?
Absolutely.
So how long should they be debarred for?
The debarment term specified by law typically is 3 years. The debarment proceedings determine first whether a debarment will occur and then determine the duration, the term of the debarment. I would recommend a permanent debarment given the number of terms and conditions of the EcoHealth Alliance grants that were violated and the severity of those violations.
So Wuhan Institute of Virology has been debarred for 10 years. Do you think it should be permanent? And why hasn't it been?
Yes, I do. I do not know why.
Why do you think it wasn't permanent?
I do not know.
Okay. So does anybody else have any background on why NIH doesn't enforce their own? I mean, it's their own rules. Have you heard of anybody from NIH being reprimanded, fired, or anything over the EcoHealth?
No.
Why do y'all think?
I think the retired head of the NIAID should be asked that question.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Romney, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for the hearing. I'd like to get a sense of, there's a lot of energy and passion around, was it from an animal or was it a lab leak? And I must admit, I don't understand why there's so much energy around that. It strikes me that we'll never be 100% sure, I presume, about one or the other. We might be 98% or something, but we'll always be a little uncertain. And given the fact that it could have been either, we know what action we ought to take to protect from either. And so why there's so much passion around it makes me think it's more political than scientific, but maybe I'm wrong. So the action, it strikes me that based on what I've heard, we shouldn't be financing gain-of-function research. What I heard was there's no particular reason for it other than military warfare. We shouldn't do that anyway. So one, we know that. Whether it came from an animal or not, we shouldn't be financing gain-of-function research. Number two, we should insist that any place we send money follows the international ISO standards. I didn't get the number, Dr. Kovalinks, but you had a number there that suggested that people have to follow. So we shouldn't be getting money or going to labs that don't follow those international standards. And number three, whether it was from a wet market or the Wuhan lab, China's to blame. Both those things were in China. And so if we're looking for someone to blame, we know who it is. It's the Chinese, and they should take responsibility for it and should have opened themselves up to complete disclosure. So am I wrong here? Is there a reason there's so much energy around whether it came from a wet market or a lab? In both cases, the action is simple. We should clean up the wet labs, and number two, we should tighten the wet markets, and number two, we should tighten the labs. What? Please go ahead, Dr. Quay.
Well, I'll just say briefly, I mean, I think the energy is around the fact that paychecks, salaries, careers are based on continuing gain-of-function research by some of the most vocal people in this debate. And I think if you follow the money, you'll see the answer.
Thank you. Dr. Gary, what's your thought?
Well, a lot of the talk around gain-of-function research depends on how you define it, and the definition is very important. I mean, there's some informal definitions that are very technical definitions. I mean, we have to get that part right, because if you define it in a way that basically interferes with a lot of biomedical research on viruses and on other things too, cancer research, everything, you're going to really cripple the biomedical research enterprise. So let's get that right. I don't think, just blanket we should stop funding all gain-of-function research, because some of that is important, like, for developing animal models of new diseases as they come forth. You have to select for a virus that can actually replicate in a distinct animal that you can use in the lab. So if you don't permit gain-of-function research, we won't be able to respond to a new threat because we won't be able to make animal models. So getting that right, getting that definition right is very important. I think that the Office of Science and Technology Policy new guidelines for this type of research is very clear. It's a good step forward. You should look at that and see what you can do best to codify that into some kind of legislation.
Yeah, Dr. Ebright, do you concur with that point of view, that we need to define exactly what kind of research is okay and which is not, which has a beneficial purpose and which has only malevolent purpose?
The definition of gain-of-function research has been clear. There is a legally controlling official definition from the U.S. policy that was in effect from 2014 to 2017, and there has been an official legally controlling definition in the U.S. policy that has been in effect from 2018 to the present. The definitions have never been in question, but the intensity that you asked about at the start of your series of questions, the intensity comes from those who are practitioners of gain-of-function research and related high-risk research on potential pandemic pathogens, who have for 2 decades successfully resisted federal oversight of their activities, for 2 decades who have insisted on self-regulation without external oversight, and who would like this to continue, despite the very real possibility, even though, as you say, not a certainty, of the fact, the very real possibility that SARS-CoV-2, a pandemic that killed 20 million and cost 25 trillion, may have come from precisely that category of research. That is the basis of the intensity. Only after there is an acknowledgement, and I see this acknowledgement today in a bipartisan fashion among members of this committee from both parties, only after there is an acknowledgement that there is a very real possibility, not a remote possibility, but a very real possibility of a lab origin, will there be the political will to impose regulation on this scientific community that has successfully resisted and obstructed regulation for 2 decades. Every other component of biomedical research that poses risks or has significant consequences has regulation, federal regulation with force of law in place. There's regulation of human subjects research. There's regulation of vertebrate animal research. There's regulation of embryonic stem cell research. But in this category of research, which is the most significant in terms of consequences and potentially existential risk, there is almost no regulation with force of law. No regulation with force of law for biosafety for any pathogen other than the smallpox virus, and no regulation with force of law for biorisk management for any pathogen. That needs to change. That's what produces this intensity.
And it strikes me that whether COVID came from a lab or it came from a wet market, that issue still has to be addressed.
Absolutely.
And so I'm not going to get so excited about where COVID happened to come from. What I know is that something very dangerous could come from gain-of-function research if it's not properly regulated. How to define where those boundaries are and what one can do and one can't do, that's something that we ought to be focused on. Even if we became 98% sure it came from a wet market, that wouldn't mean that gain-of-function research could by itself become a huge danger to humanity, and therefore we ought to regulate it. Is that something that you gentlemen agree with, or am I making a mistake on that?
I completely agree with you, Senator Romney. That's well stated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Senator Hall, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. Thanks for the witnesses for being here. You know, I have to say, I think one of the worst things that happened in the COVID era is that our own government deliberately withheld information from us, from the American people, tried to propagandize the American people, used the arms and agencies of government to actively censor Americans who dared to question the propaganda, and they're still lying to us. And I'll give you the proof of it. I wrote the bill that requires the administration to declassify the intelligence assessments and reports related to the origins of COVID-19. Now listen, I just want to say, everybody sitting on this dais has read these. I've read them. I guarantee you my colleagues have read them. I know what the Energy Department concluded. I know what the FBI concluded. I knew what they concluded years ago because we could read them when people like Dr. Fauci were out there saying the lab leak hypothesis was totally discredited and nonsense. You could go read the intelligence and know our own government thought otherwise. And at this late hour, this government still refuses to release the intelligence. They are blatantly disregarding the law that this body passed, the Senate passed, unanimously. The propaganda involved in the origins of COVID-19 is astounding to me. It recalls the worst of the wartime propaganda in years past when the government would deliberately lie to people. And here that's what they have been doing with COVID-19 and are still doing it. You know, you had this whole cabal led by Dr. Fauci and others who, as soon as the lab leak hypothesis that we now know is a lot more than a hypothesis, as soon as it's mentioned, what did Fauci do? We know because this has all been litigated in a federal district court. In fact, in multiple federal courts. I've got the finding of fact from the court right here. They lay it all out. Fauci goes to the WHO, asks the WHO to intervene to discredit the lab leak. He then speaks against it multiple times from the podium at the White House. He then does countless media interviews. I mean, my gosh, what show has he not been on? He's still on TV, spewing this misinformation, as he would call it. But he did these multiple interviews where he says, no way, no how, lab leak not possible at all. And then he coordinates, and the whole federal government coordinates with the biggest tech companies in the world to suppress, and media companies to suppress any American who would ask questions about it. It's absolutely disgraceful. Dr. Gary, you were part of this propaganda effort. I mean, you were right at the center of it. It's astounding. You wrote this piece, this Nature magazine piece or whatever it was that we've heard testimony here today, Nature Medicine, March 17th, 2020. We've heard testimony here today from other scientists on the panel that it's basically an opinion piece. You said at the time that definitively SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct, Of course, our own government, key agencies have concluded otherwise. And on the basis of this, Dr. Fauci and others cited this piece and went out to use it to mobilize our own government to censor people who ask questions about it. People lost their jobs because of this. They lost their jobs, they lost their standing, they were kicked off Facebook, they were kicked off Twitter. Do you regret being part of this effort, this propaganda effort?
Sir, I was simply just writing a paper about our scientific opinions about where this virus came from.
Oh, no, you weren't. You said in an email that we now have that you tried to withhold, but that we have, February 2nd, 2020, you wrote, I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you can get from the bat virus or one very similar to it to this. I'm quoting you, I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature. It's stunning. Of course, in the lab, it would be easy.
Well, of course. And I actually figured it out. That's the whole point of
You
that.
figured it out? You wrote this while you were writing your propaganda piece, while you were writing
I
your
wrote
paper.
that somewhere around February 2nd.
Yeah, it was exactly February 2nd. And you've testified that you were writing your proximal origin paper in early February. So you're saying that, what did it come to you overnight?
There was new data that
Like
came in.
A revelation from God.
No. It's
Overnight you concluded,
method.
I got it, I figured it out, and now I can definitively rule out. It's amazing. Is that what happened?
It's just the scientific method.
Oh, it's just science. Oh, it's the scientific method that happened at lightning speed and then was used to propagandize and lie to and shut down. As a scientist who's supposedly supposed to follow facts, do you regret the fact that your work was used to censor your fellow scientists? It was used to censor ordinary Americans who ask questions about the virus? Do you regret that?
When you write a paper, I mean, you get it in the journal. We can't control what happens after.
Oh, I see. So you're not responsible at all. It's amazing. Nobody who is involved in any of this is responsible. Never.
Yeah.
They're not responsible.
Yeah, but
People have lost their jobs.
Yeah.
People have lost probably their health care associated with their jobs. People have been run out of public, they're not available in polite society. You can't show your face because, my gosh, you question.
Yeah.
But you don't have anything to do with it. Why have so many of your papers, your other papers, been retracted or subjected to formal expressions of concern?
Yeah, well,
why is that?
There's a long story behind that.
Four of them, right? I mean, you've had in July 26, 2021, Virology retracted a paper of yours. Also in 2021, the Journal of General Virology retracted another of your papers. In March of 2022, an expression of concern was added by an editor of yet another journal to another of your papers. In April 4th of 2024, a third scientific paper of yours was retracted from the Journal of Medical Virology.
Yeah.
Is this normal?
Those papers didn't come from my lab, but I'm certainly helping.
They're not yours?
They're not mine, no.
Oh, so your
I'm
your
on the
work
paper, but they did not come
the work
from my
that,
lab.
that God gave you in a flash of inspiration remains absolutely unimpeachable, unimpeached.
We stand by that.
Do you stand by your assertion in your Nature piece that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct? Could not be?
We do, and that's exactly the same
Couldn't possibly be.
conclusion that the intelligence community came to.
Oh, no, that is a lie. Let's stop right there.
Well, it's
that
right here. I have
is
it right here.
a lie. I have read the intelligence community did not come to that conclusion. Multiple intelligence community agents and components have concluded it was likely a lab leak. And they concluded that at the same time that you and your people were propagandizing the American public and using the channels and influence of the American government to censor ordinary Americans.
Yeah.
That is the truth. I'm not going to sit here and allow you to lie any further. Dr. Gary, you have disgracefully participated in shameful propaganda that has been one of the worst chapters in this country's history, with the government propagandizing its own people. And you know what? You may be right about I'm not a scientist. I don't know. But what I do know is, it is wrong. It is wrong to censor and lie to the American public. It is wrong to withhold critical information from them. And it is wrong to countenance that and to say, oh, I just had nothing to do with it. Gee, I wish we could have done better. You should have done better, sir. You should have done better. And because you didn't, people have suffered. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Could I?
Dr. Gary, if you'd like to respond, I think you can respond to your question.
Yeah. So, actually, Senator Hawley, I'm going to agree with you about something. I do think that we should learn more information from the intelligence community, what they found. I agree with you that they should be more open and tell where those conclusions came from. At the FBI and at the Energy Department, all the agencies should come forth with more information. So there's a point we can agree with. I mean, that was an interesting exchange, but all we did was write a paper, Nature Medicine, and 3,000 words. It's been one of the most scrutinized papers in history. It's held up very well. It wasn't an attempt to distort things and to mislead the American public. It was just simply a paper, like the many other scientific papers that I've written in my career.
Let's we'll move on to a second round. I'll tell the members we have a vote that I believe has already been called. We also have a hard stop at a little after 12. So the second round will be 5 minutes. And I'll start. Actually, Dr. I'll just pick up from your answer there. A lot has been directed towards the paper that you wrote and the research that went into that. Does the science since the paper came out strengthen your argument or weaken it? What does the science show?
It absolutely strengthens it. I mean, we published a series of papers after the proximal origins paper, all of them, conclusively moving towards the natural origin hypothesis. So nothing, we stand by that paper. It was a good paper.
We're currently seeing enormous changes in technology in the biological sciences, from artificial intelligence to biological design tools, even robot laboratories where experiments can be conducted from really anywhere on the globe. Dr. Koblenz, my question for you is, in your opinion, will these types of technological changes make it easier or harder for us to determine the origins of future pandemics?
The advances you just discussed will definitely make it more complicated to do that. On the one hand, we are going to have much more sophisticated capabilities to analyze viral genomes and do the kind of analyses that are some of the feature of Dr. Gary's work to understand the evolution of these pathogens and where they come from. And so that will be incredibly useful investigating any future outbreak. On the other hand, the fact that these technologies are going to be globally diffused, the fact that there are a growing number of high and maximum containment laboratories that conduct high consequence research will make it a more complicated process, because there will be more potential sources for outbreaks, whether they're naturally occurring or from laboratories. So the technologies are not a net negative, but they're not a panacea. But it's definitely going to be a much more complicated endeavor to go through this exercise in the future.
Very good. Dr. Quay, a question for you. We know the U.S. intelligence community has reported that a few scientists at the Wuhan lab got sick in December, the fall of 2019. But it's not clear that any of them had COVID-19. So my question for you, sir, is what evidence do we have that someone at the Wuhan lab got COVID-19 before anyone else did? And do you know if these scientists actually got tested for COVID-19?
No, I don't. All of my data around that relies on the State Department statement. There were 3 individuals. We believe we know one of them, at least. Ben Hu was responsible for some of the synthetic work in the laboratory. Reasonably young person who was hospitalized, who is said to have been hospitalized with a X-ray confirmed disease consistent with COVID-19, but not blood testing. We do know also that in March of 2020, Dr. Shi reported that no one at the Wuhan Institute of Virology had SARS-CoV-2. And with another individual, we did a statistical analysis of the probability of that with the incidence in Wuhan, and that is not a truthful statement because of that. So those are the 2 facts I have.
Dr. Gary, you want to respond?
Senator Peters, could I read from the Intelligence Committee, the Director of Office of National Intelligence, about these 3 supposed sick workers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? And they write, while several WIV researchers fell mildly ill in fall 2019, they experienced a range of symptoms consistent with colds or allergies with accompanying symptoms typically not associated with COVID-19, and some of them were confirmed to have been sick with other illnesses unrelated to COVID-19. So the 3 sick workers at the WIV is simply a myth.
Dr. Quay, what specific hard evidence proves that the Wuhan lab did experiments that created the virus? Do we have specific hard evidence?
No, one of our biggest challenges is we don't know what they've done inside there. We know what they were doing in the past. We know what they did in the fall of 2019, all consistent with the things you would do if there had been a laboratory accident there. Filing a patent, first patent out of 600 patents for a device to prevent a coronavirus infection in an infected worker. One of the inventors on that patent is a PLA military doctor scientist. The head of the laboratory was dismissed, and a PLA the soldier was put in charge of the laboratory December 2019. So we don't have access inside the laboratory. We probably will never have it. But the genome inside the virus comports to the diffuse grant in such a way that it's inconsistent. I mean, in a court of law, you find someone criminally for 95% or greater probabilities, and this is 1 in a billion, which is greater than that this is a synthetic virus.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth. So I mean, a lot of these are assumptions that you're making, not hard evidence.
The hard evidence is the incidence of the features of SARS-CoV-2 can individually be looked at in nature. They can be identified with the frequency in nature, and then you can say, what is the chance that each of these were combined in one virus at the same time? This is what virologists do all the time in looking for origins. And when you do that, you conclude that it has a 1 in a billion chance of coming from nature, and it meets all 7 criteria of the diffuse grant.
Okay, thank you. Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for questions.
Dr. Gary indicated that the intelligence community was somewhat unified, or a lot of them believe this came from animals, and that's just not true. The ones that have been vocal about this and talked a lot about it have been the DOE, which has more scientists than any other agency in Washington, probably other than NIH. They've concluded that it did come from the lab. FBI concluded it came from the lab, and we have a whistleblower from the CIA that says the scientists that were convened to study this voted 6-1 to say it came from the lab, and then they were overruled by superiors for political reasons. So there's a lot of evidence that people within the intel agencies actually do believe that there is evidence that it came from the lab. In addition to people getting sick, there's also about a week in October where they do imagery of who's using a cell phone, and nobody's using a cell phone in the lab for about a week. So the lab's completely empty for about a week, and some people think that was during a cleanup period. But if you're sitting at home and you're sort of an independent, you hear scientists over here saying gain of function is the best thing since sliced bread, and over here you're saying, well, we really haven't developed any meaningful vaccines or technology from this, you're like, who do I believe? And who you believe does go to character. And so we have to look at some of the statements. Like I say, I've never seen anything like this between public and private statements. So Christian Anderson, early on in this, sends an email to Fauci. And as Fauci says, Bob Gary, and a couple of the other virologists, we think it's inconsistent. This virus, this genetic sequence of COVID is inconsistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. So they believed it didn't come from nature. They had looked at this. These are smart people that when they were not looking at it, when they were trying to look at it through an objective lens, concluded one thing until they came to another conclusion that it might hurt the business of science and the arrangements they had going on with China, and concluded opposite. But with Christian Anderson, it's stark because he says, Bob and all these, we all believe it's inconsistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. A week later, Christian Anderson is saying, what I like to use when I talk to the public is, I like to tell them it's consistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. So he goes from inconsistent to consistent, complete opposite approach within days, maybe even simultaneously as these papers are being written. So really the hypocrisy of those involved and those who are saying not a laboratory construct, if you want to know who to believe, look at their private statements versus their public statements. So we have gain of function is the best thing since sliced bread, or gain of function is a real problem. Now, Senator Romney's like, well, why does it matter if there's a chance we should do something? I think he's right. If you believe there's a 1% chance we should do something. But if you think there's a 1% chance, or you want to sort of glad hand people at the end and say, well, we should do something, their argument for the people who think it's not likely to happen is going to be, oh, the administration's already fixed this. It's already done, and all we need is a few little regulatory things. We don't need legislation. We don't need independent oversight. We don't need people looking at this who aren't on the receiving end of the money. This is the whole problem of NIH. The people regulating themselves are getting the money. So the administration has put in place some regulations to try to, help with the buying of select agents. And Dr. Quay, if you could explain to us what a few MIT scientists did recently and how well the administrative regulations are working without actual congressional legislation?
Sure. So 3 scientists at MIT said they were going to be a red team, and they contacted the FBI because what they were going to do was about to be potentially illegal. And they put together ricin and the 1918 influenza. Those 2 are select agents, and they're highly lethal. And they broke the genes up in a particular way. They added some benign genes, and then they put out test orders roughly following the White House guidelines, test orders to see if laboratories would send them the pieces they needed to build these viruses or ricin, or they would stop them. And in fact, in 94% of the time, they sent the pieces right to them. They purposely didn't make the active strain of the RNA. They made the inactive strain to show that they could do it. But they proved they could make ricin. They proved they could make the 1918 influenza under the guidance that have just come out of the White House in a way that
this gets at where we go forward. Our next hearing, or one of our next hearings, is going to be, what do we do for gain of function reform? What kind of committee do we set up to look at this? And if the answer is from the other side, oh, it's already done, the White House did it, this is showing you what the White House did, even if it was well-intentioned, didn't work. These scientists got the material off the internet to create the Spanish flu that killed 50, 100 million people. So this is not something we should scoff at and say, oh, it's not a laboratory construct. We don't do anything here. Let the administration do this. And I would say this if it were a Republican administration. I don't care which party it's in. I agree with scientists like Kevin Esvelt who equate this with nuclear weapons. This is incredibly important and needs congressional oversight on the select agents, but also on the gain of function. Now, some people think this just started. It's incredibly partisan. And I'll just for a quick answer, then a more extensive answer. Dr. Ebright, are you part of the right-wing conspiracy? Are you somehow some kind of crazy Republican partisan?
I'm a registered Democrat. I voted for Biden. I had a Biden sign on my lawn and had a Biden bumper sticker on my car.
That's enough of that. But the main point I wanted to make is this isn't a partisan thing. In fact, when I've talked to Dr. Ebright, he says he got involved with this after 9/11 when the anthrax attacks came. But then more involved in 2010 as it heated up, and everybody was talking about in the scientific community when scientists took the avian flu, which is very, very deadly in humans, but like most animal virus, not very transmissible in humans, and they mutated it, Fouchier and others in Netherlands, to make it spread through the air and to spread to mammals. That's a crazy thing. And if people think that's a benign use of gain of function, we should never, ever listen to people like that. Who else thinks it was benign and we didn't need to do anything? Anthony Fauci. There have been these 2 camps. There has been this debate going on for a decade. I think this is a very good debate. It should be an intellectual debate, but realize these are the people, Collins and Fauci, who were saying, take these people down, take down the people we disagree with. This is not scientific debate. They were taking us off the internet. People are not playing under the American rules, not playing under the scientific method, and they should be discounted. But we have to have a real debate over this. So as we move forward, and I'd like to ask you, Dr. Ebright, on this, how important is it that we actually have a law passed and that we actually have regulators that are scientists, but that are outside of the supply of money, outside of the exchange of grant money?
I think it's a matter of survival. It's that important. There needs to be an entity that is independent of agencies that fund research and perform research, to eliminate the structural conflict of interest that has existed with current self-regulation by agencies that perform and fund research.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Johnson, we can answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In Eisenhower's very prescient farewell speech, he not only warned us about the military-industrial complex, he warned us about government funding of research. He said, if you do that, scientists are going to be more interested in their grant, in obtaining a grant, than pursuing truthful science. He said you end up with a scientific and technological elite that would drive public policy, and I think we witnessed that during COVID. They drove it in a very bad direction. So I want to talk about the cover-up again. Dr. Gary, how much have you received in government grants over your career? Do you have any figure in that, a ballpark?
Sir, I'm not sure.
Hundreds of millions?
Not hundreds.
So I have information that between you and Dr. Kirsten Anderson, since 2020, between 2020 and 2022, you received $25.2 million in grants from the NIH.
That's possible.
That's accurate? Okay,
Could be.
so after you write the proximal origin theory, you've been working with Dr. Fauci how many years?
Well, I don't actually work directly with Dr. Fauci.
Well, I mean, you've certainly come to his aid and testified kind of in his support during AIDS. But the fact is, you cashiered $25.2 million in government grants after writing the proximal origin paper, didn't you? $25.2 million in grants. And again, it's Anthony Fauci.
It wasn't because we wrote
Anthony Fauci has let out billions of dollars worth of grants, right? He controls an awful lot of information. Again, the point being, why would they cover it up? January 27, 2020, Dr. Fauci is informed via email that NIAID has been funding coronavirus project in China for the last 5 years. Okay, so he's given, these are the emails that were FOIA'd. They weren't given to us, and they're heavily redacted. January 31st, he starts conversations with Dr. Anderson and et al., Dr. Gary. February 1st, Dr. Fauci emails, and my screen went dead on me here, rats. Do you have that? Fauci emails his principal deputy director, Hugh Auchincloss. And here's the... He said, Hugh, it is essential that we speak this AM. Keep your cell phone on. I have a conference call at 7:45. These will likely be over at 8:45. Read this paper as well as the email that I will forward to you. You will have tasks today that must be done. Now that is somebody who's scrambling to cover up his backside for funding dangerous research at the Wuhan lab for 5 years. Is that correct? Dr. Ebright, I'll ask you that question, but in addition, you've basically accused Dr. Gary of scientific misconduct, possibly as serious as fraud. Why don't you address that? Because I would agree with you.
Both on the proximal origin paper, I have signed 2 letters by teams of scientists requesting an editorial review of that paper for retraction for misconduct. And then on 2 of the market papers, there are only 4 published, only 2
but
published.
Again, what was the misconduct you've accused him, but what was the misconduct
The primary misconduct, the misconduct of highest importance, was stating conclusions the authors knew at the time, contemporaneously, while writing the paper, submitting the paper, and publishing the paper, were untrue. This is the most egregious form of scientific misconduct, publishing a paper where you know the conclusions are untrue.
And of course, the reason we didn't get those emails other than through a court order is that the emails themselves were so unbelievably incriminating
That is
that
correct.
they thought one thing and wrote the exact other for an article that then was quoted like 5,800 times. I mean, that, again, as Senator Hawley and others have pointed out, destroyed people's careers. They were ridiculed. They were vilified.
Yes.
That is scientific misconduct and fraud. And Dr. Gary, I have to say, if people are bemoaning the fact that people no longer trust science or that we don't trust our federal health agencies, the reason the American public legitimately don't trust scientists and federal health agencies are because of people like you. You bear that responsibility for violating the public's trust from your scientific misconduct and fraud. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Gary, you
Thank
can.
you so much. So I would just encourage people to go and read the Nature Medicine article, The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. We didn't put anything in that paper that we didn't believe was true. The conclusions of that paper have held up very well. In fact, there's been an abundance of scientific evidence that has come forward since then to support all the conclusions, everything we wrote in that paper. So there's no fraud. Yes, indeed, some of the authors changed their mind during the course of writing that paper over a period of weeks. That's not fraud, sir. That is just the way that the scientific method works.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would ask consent to enter all these Slack messages from this, Dr. Anderson et al., that group, that have all these quotes into our hearing record, and we'll provide them to you. Thank you.
Objection. Senator Marshall, you recognize for your questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Gary, I think it's also important to point out a couple of things, and one is that you've received $60 million of grants from the NIH over the years, and you have your own vaccine company. And that obviously is a bit of a conflict of interest, and I don't think the scientific world really agrees with your conclusion that it stood up to the test of times. I think the proximal origin article is literally an editorial, an opinion page. But unfortunately, our intelligence community took it as the gospel. I think it's also interesting to me that within the scientific community, that two agencies, the Department of Energy and FBI, said they lean towards a lab leak origin of this. That's public knowledge. And that they had the scientists to actually understand what the heck we're talking about. They're realizing that there's no way that nature could have made this virus. There's so many things wrong with your theory. And all you come back to is, it started in the wet market. But you've yet to show us an intermediate host. You've yet to show us progenitor species. All the farms that farm these animals outside of the market, how many of those animals were positive? I think the answer is none. I want to go down this OD&I route for just a second. It's a fact that the OD&I has not complied with the law. Congress has passed legislation to declassify information related to COVID origins. OD&I has not complied. Leaving OD&I in charge ensures a total monitoring control of the information, the misinformation. That's why we have to move this investigation outside of the OD&I. Additionally, it's a fact that our current grant research process hides the ultimate beneficiaries of U.S. grant research and bypasses all export controls. All of that has to be changed. This is why we need a 9/11 style investigation outside of cameras, outside of the politics here on Capitol Hill, to find out where this virus came from, what did the U.S. do to contribute, and how do we keep this from happening again. Dr. Quay, I want to go back to some line of question we were going down earlier, that just the research being done in Wuhan, China. I think that there's a naivety upon Americans to think that the Chinese military is in one place doing research and the WIV is doing research and the CCP is not involved. What's it like to work in labs in Wuhan and the interaction between the CCP and those entities? What does their day usually start with?
Well, I think one of the telling ways to see that is without visiting them is to go through the minutes of laboratory meetings, which you can get a hold of. They're in Chinese. You can translate them. And unlike laboratory meetings in the U.S., which are pretty much you start presenting your data, you challenge your data and that, they start with a recitation of what the Communist Party's missions are with respect to their position in the world and the role of their research, and it goes down a litany. And these are by Communist Party members who are part of every lab meeting present, and then they finally start talking about the research into the lab, but not at the beginning.
And then the military takes over the WIV in December as well to promote the cover-up. What is the interaction between the Chinese military and the WIV scientists?
Well, so the woman that took over was the one that was most responsible for the response to the SARS-1. And interestingly, if you look at the closest viruses to SARS-CoV-2, so you got RATG13, which is inside the WIV. You've got the Banel viruses from Laos. We know WIV is sampling there. The next one down are two viruses that were collected by the PLA Army and began studying in 2017. The S2 region of the spike protein is almost identical to those viruses that were originally collected by the PLA Army. The first genetic cluster of patients that had both lineage A, lineage B, were in the PLA hospital 3 kilometers from the WIV.
Okay. I think we've debated back and forth about the benefits and risk of viral gain-of-function research, and I'm just going to say viral manipulation, so we don't have to worry about your silly definitions that are used to obscure what's really happening here. I'm going to ask each one of you, do you feel comfortable funding any type of viral manipulation research with foreign entities that are hostile towards America, like the CCP? Dr. Ebright?
I think there are strong reasons for international collaboration in science with both allied nations and adversary nations. However, there's a line that never should be crossed, and that is research that has weapons implications and research on discovery and enhancement of bioweapons agents, like the research on SARS viruses in Wuhan, most surely is an example of such research.
I'd like to go through the questions, but I think I should be respectful of everyone's time. And thank you so much, Chairman, for giving us this second round. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. One quick question came up for me, Dr. Craven. You talked about the genetic features could only happen in a lab, and I'd just like to ask Dr. Gary, do the genetic features, could those only come from lab experiments, or is there a natural evolution?
Of course not. I mean, Dr. Quay mentioned the virus called Banal 2052. That virus is extremely close to SARS-CoV-2. In fact, if we isolated both of those viruses out in nature and didn't know anything about a pandemic, you would say those are, in the same very close family together. So Banal 52 is essentially a very close member of SARS-CoV-2. It's got all the genetic features of SARS-CoV-2. Certainly the fact that virus is in nature shows that SARS-CoV-2 could have arisen through a natural process.
Dr. Ebert?
A virus has no furin cleavage site, as Dr. Gary is aware.
I mean, the furin cleavage site is not the only feature of the virus that makes it a virus that's able to cause a pandemic. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of other changes that the virus has to go through before it can, have that potential. Nobody in a laboratory would know how to put those features into any virus, let alone one that's 97 or 96% similar to SARS-CoV-2.
Dr. Quay?
When you passage a virus, when you do serial passage of a virus, Darwin and evolution selects for the right positions. So when you look at 3,800 possible changes in the amino acid and the receptor binding domain, all but 17 changes are not improvements. So SARS-CoV-2 is at 99% perfected for the receptor binding domains of humans. SARS-1, when it first jumped to humans, had 15% and evolved over a couple of years to get to the pandemic stage. You started out with a 99% perfect virus, which is serial passage.
So, Dr. Quay, the Banal 52 virus, the receptor binding domain is 50 amino acids long. 49 of those 50 are the same as in SARS-CoV-2. You don't have to, create any kind of scenario where you're passing viruses in a lab. That RBD, the receptor binding domain, is already in nature, essentially fully formed.
Very good. So Ranking Member Paul and I are holding these hearings, and we want to be thinking about the future. How do we make sure that we handle pandemics or potential pandemics much better in the future? So I'm going to ask each of you a brief question. In the event that we never get to the bottom of how this pandemic started, both Ranking Member Paul and I believe that we've got to do everything we can to put forward policies that will hopefully prevent a future pandemic. So I'd like each of you to identify. I'm going to go down. I'll start with Mr. Koblenz and then go down, just to identify briefly in the remaining time here, one or two priority actions that we should take to help us prevent the next pandemic. If there's one or two thoughts that this committee should take to heart, what would that be? Dr. Koblenz?
So in order to address the threat of the natural zoonotic spillover pandemic, there really needs to be a One Health approach to biosurveillance and preventing spillover in key countries that have, ecologically are prime for disease emergence. For the lab origin possibilities, we need a much stronger global architecture for biorisk management. And underlying all that, we need a much stronger biosurveillance system, both domestically and internationally, to detect these outbreaks as soon as possible and guide the medical and public health responses we need to prevent outbreaks from becoming pandemics.
Dr. Gary?
I mean, I guess my recommendation would be a very practical one. I mean, we have bird flu in our dairy cattle in the United States as we're speaking here. That's a very dangerous virus. I would take a look at that and see what we can do to, keep the unthinkable from happening and that virus acquiring extra features maybe recombination of the virus from a pig, maybe recombination of the virus from human, to turn that into a virus that would be very, very difficult to control its spread right now with our current technologies.
Thank you. Dr. Gray?
4 recommendations. One is to move the oversight of select agent research and gain of function outside of NIH, NIAID, and into some independent institutional review board. You could model it after human research boards, institutional review boards, number 1. Number 2, is taking Western biotechnology equipment, which right now is the superior equipment, US, UK primarily, and putting it under export control. So at least we know where the machines are going, and perhaps we could put some controls over it. Number 3 is simple. Don't put these next to lines, subways where accidents can happen. And number 4, gain of opportunity, where you don't necessarily do viral research, but you go out and try to collect a virus that it's in a cave, it has no chance of running into a human. You bring it back to a city with 11 million people. You purify it out of a sample for feces where there's 200 other viruses. You make it pure. You make it 10 to the 4th, 10 to the 5th, a million more copies of it, setting up a laboratory accident. Gain of opportunity has the same risks as gain of gain of function. We should look at those. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ebert?
Legislation should address 3 subjects. The first is establishing a review entity that is independent of agencies that fund biomedical research and perform biomedical research to eliminate the conflict of interest that exists today. 2, the oversight must cover all forms of research irrespective of funding source, not only federally funded research, but also other funded research, and must cover research both unclassified and classified in character. And 3, these improvements in oversight need to be codified in law so that they are enforceable with rule of law. Voluntary self-regulation, voluntary guidance, and best practices have not worked, and they will not work in the future. So legislation for an independent review, legislation for a comprehensive review, irrespective of funding source and classification status, and legislation for enforceable oversight with force of law. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to thank each of our witnesses here for joining us today, for your testimony, for your expertise. Appreciate your concrete solutions as to next steps going forward, and we'll likely reach out to you again and again to continue to flesh out these ideas. Pandemics and other infectious disease outbreaks will unfortunately be an enduring threat to our country and to our world. And while the question of the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic remains unresolved, I think it's clear that there are things that we can and must pursue to reduce biological risk here, at home, and abroad. I hope this committee's work will also result in restoring and maintaining the trust in public health agencies and the scientific process, as we will need to make sure we're doing that to prevent future pandemics in this country. I look forward to our continuing work together to improve the federal government's ability to prevent, to detect, and to respond to biological threats. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on July 3rd of 2024 for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.
Hey, you do okay?
Yes, you did great.